It was an ordinary day in New York, in a neighborhood where luxury boutiques stood side by side, each more impressive than the last, with gleaming windows and items so exclusive they seemed destined for a separate world. The cobblestone streets overflowed with elegant passers-by, accustomed to this opulence, while the spotless windows displayed mannequins draped in rare fabrics and brands easily recognizable at a glance. A young black boy, barely a teenager, walked into one of these prestigious shops, his worn sneakers contrasting with the gleaming marble beneath his feet. His eyes, filled with nervousness but also determination, quickly scanned the room. He immediately felt out of place in this glittering world, where every detail, from the subtle fragrance floating in the air to the crystal chandeliers, seemed designed to intimidate those who didn't belong. Despite the feeling of being watched, even judged, he had a clear goal in mind. Today, he wanted to buy something special. A stylish shirt for his mother's birthday. This wasn't just any purchase for him. Far from it. He had saved for months, setting aside every dollar he could. It was his little secret, a way to show his mother how much he loved and appreciated her. He hoped this shirt, which he imagined wrapping her in grace and elegance, would be the perfect gift. The atmosphere in the store, appearing plush and welcoming, nonetheless held a coldness for the boy. The dimmed lighting, which highlighted the luxurious textures of the displayed clothes, offered no comfort. On the contrary, each ray of light seemed to point directly at him, like a spotlight, emphasizing his incongruity in this exclusive environment. Behind the counter, the store employees, dressed in immaculate uniforms, threw furtive glances in his direction. Their polite smiles seemed forced, as if they were waiting to see what role the boy would play in this luxury theater. Their looks betrayed their silent judgment. To them, he was not an ordinary customer. He was an anomaly, an intruder in a world where only familiar faces and limitless credit cards were seen. The young boy tried to remain calm, taking deep breaths to steady his nerves. He made his way to the display where the shirts were neatly folded, each tagged with a price that, for some, represented just a number, but for him, it meant months of effort. He ran his trembling fingers over the soft fabric of a white shirt, imagining how beautiful his mother would look wearing it. This moment, which should have been filled with pride and satisfaction, was tinged with a deep apprehension, as if an invisible shadow hovered over him. He didn't know yet, but that shadow had already taken shape, growing in the corner of the store, hidden among the gleaming luxury goods. A white police officer, imposing in stature as much as in uniform, had stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the young boy enter. A mixture of surprise and suspicion crossed his face, quickly followed by a certainty rooted in years of prejudice. This man, with his self-assured demeanor and rigid posture, embodied authority in its most brutal and unquestioning form. He didn't need to know the facts to make his judgment. To him, the boy's appearance alone was enough to determine his role in the store. The uniform he wore, with its shiny insignia and imposing belt, seemed to give him a kind of absolute power, like a shield against any doubt or challenge. His gaze, cold and piercing, was that of a man used to controlling situations, to imposing his authority without being questioned. To him, there was no room for nuance or explanation. He knew, or at least thought he knew, what the presence of this young black boy in a luxury store meant. A potential crime to come, an invisible but palpable threat. What could he possibly be doing here? He must have silently wondered, his face betraying a suspicion eager to be confirmed. The very idea that a black boy could simply be a customer, that he could be there to buy a gift for his mother, didn't even cross his mind. His thoughts were already aligned with a single hypothesis. This boy was suspicious. His very presence, his appearance, justified immediate suspicion in the officer's eyes. His judgment had been made before he had even observed anything. The officer didn't waste any time. Driven by this heightened sense of alertness, he decided to follow the boy, without discretion. His thick boots softly echoed on the marble floor as he moved, his eyes never leaving the boy's frail and nervous figure. Every move the boy made was scrutinized with intensity, analyzed through the lens of this visceral distrust. When the boy reached for a shirt, a simple hesitation became, in the officer's eyes, a sign of guilt. Every gesture took on exaggerated significance in his mind. To him, this wasn't a clumsy teenager trying to choose a gift. This was a potential thief surveying the terrain before a theft. His gaze, filled with hasty judgments, never left the boy. For this man, the simple act of a young black boy buying something in such an exclusive place wasn't just unlikely, it was almost unthinkable. His presence in this rich setting was an anomaly to be corrected, a threat to be anticipated. Now closer, but still at a respectable distance, the officer continued to watch, close enough to observe but far enough to remain unnoticed. Every movement the boy made seemed to reinforce the officer's preconceived belief. This boy couldn't be here to buy, he must be here to steal, to take advantage, to break the invisible rules of a world that, in the officer's eyes, was not his. The young boy, trying his best to keep calm, felt his hands tremble slightly as he picked up the shirt he had chosen for his mother. The soft, carefully folded fabric symbolized all the effort he had made to get to this moment. It was more than just a purchase. It was an act of love, a gesture to honor the person who had sacrificed everything for him. He imagined his mother's emotional smile when she unwrapped the gift, thinking it would be one of those rare moments of pure joy. But at that instant, before he could even make his way to the register, everything shifted. A sharp sound behind him, like a heavy and deliberate step, froze him in place. Before he could even process what was happening, a rough voice rose, cutting through the air of the store with an unexpected brutality. "What are you doing here, kid?" the officer said, his tone icy, abruptly interrupting the young boy's innocent gesture. The tone of his voice, filled with contempt, left no doubt about his intentions. He wasn't here to ask questions. He was here to judge, accuse, and humiliate. The officer, tall and imposing, hands on his hips, looked at the boy as one would look at an intruder caught in the act. The store's plush atmosphere shifted into an oppressive scene, as if the walls themselves were closing in around the young boy. The few customers who had been absorbed in their own shopping suddenly turned away, carefully avoiding any involvement in the unfolding drama. The heavy silence that lingered only added another layer of tension, making the situation even more unbearable. "Do you really think you can buy something here?" the officer continued, his voice growing sharper, a sneer curling his lips. His words, dripping with disdain, felt like invisible blows, striking the young man who stood there, motionless, with a shirt still in his trembling hands. The boy, stunned by the brutal injustice of the situation, couldn't find anything to say. How could he? Every word from the officer was an attack on his dignity, a questioning of his right to be there in the store simply to buy a gift. He suddenly felt very small, very vulnerable, as though the weight of the world was on his shoulders. What had been a moment he dreamed of with pride was turning before his eyes into a humiliating nightmare. The officer's gaze, filled with contempt, scrutinized every inch of the boy's body, as if searching for tangible proof of his supposed guilt. To him, it was already clear, a young black boy in a luxury store could only be there for one reason. The mere idea that he might be a customer like the others never even crossed his mind. His mind, locked by years of prejudice, allowed no other interpretation. The young boy lowered his eyes slightly, seeking a moment of respite from the avalanche of unjust judgments. But before he could take a step, the officer advanced with a sharp movement, towering over him, driving the point home even further. "No, it doesn't work like that," he added with cruel certainty. This was no longer simply a matter of surveillance or security. It was a display of power, a way for the officer to remind this young black boy that he didn't belong in a space he believed was reserved for a white, affluent elite. The boy wanted to speak, to explain that he was there for a simple, noble reason, to make his mother happy. But the words stuck in his throat, as if they were too heavy to be said. Every attempt to respond died before it could form. He felt the discreet glances of the other customers, some full of discomfort, others simply indifferent, but none of them dared intervene, as if they were watching a street scene from a distance. "Do you really think you can come here and steal?" spat the officer, his gaze full of judgment. His words rang out like a verdict, and the humiliation settled in the store like an unwanted guest. The customers, frozen, watched the scene with palpable discomfort, some turning their eyes away, others whispering among themselves, creating an atmosphere of unease and apprehension. What the officer didn't know was that the boy he had just humiliated was no ordinary young man. He was the son of a powerful FBI agent, a respected man known for his integrity and commitment to fighting crime, as well as for his determination to challenge racial prejudice. The boy's father, a black man who had risen through the ranks of authority through hard work, had always instilled in his son values of honesty, dignity, and resilience. As the officer continued spewing baseless accusations, the boy felt a surge of anger and injustice. This situation had become far more than a simple incident. It touched the very essence of his identity and his father's legacy. The humiliations he had faced because of his skin color intertwined with his father's teachings, reminding him that dignity was a right, not a privilege. In the midst of this darkness, a light of hope began to shine through. He thought of his father, his struggles, his victories, and how he had always insisted on the importance of standing tall in the face of adversity. The boy realized that the officer, by belittling his existence, could not take away his worth. The officer was blind to the truth standing before him. A boy who, despite his apparent vulnerability, carried within him the strength of his family's legacy. "I'm not stealing, I'm here to buy a gift for my mom," the boy retorted, his voice trembling but filled with courage. His heart raced, but he had made up his mind to face this injustice with dignity. At that moment, the officer, who had already proclaimed himself judge and jury, began to feel uneasy. The boy's determination and sincere response challenged his arrogance. The crowd slowly began to gather around them, a murmur of support emerging from the witnesses' lips. The FBI agent, though physically absent, was there in the boy's spirit, a comforting and defining presence. The boy knew that his response to this humiliation could potentially influence the general perception of authority. This was a turning point, not only for him but for all those who had been victims of similar injustices. At that moment, a woman in the store, a witness to this unacceptable interaction, spoke up. "Excuse me, but I think you're wrong about this young man," she said firmly, drawing everyone's attention. "I saw him come in, and he was just looking for a gift, like everyone else here. We all have the right to shop without being judged." Her statement, delivered with a defiant tone, encouraged other customers to murmur their agreement. The officer, realizing that he was now the center of public attention, began to lose his confidence. He looked around, unsure of how to extricate himself from this embarrassing situation. The boy felt a wave of relief and solidarity. He knew the woman was right, and that his father, had he been present, would have been proud of the way he handled this confrontation. Perhaps that day, by facing humiliation with dignity, he would not only defend his personal honor but also embody the collective struggle of those who had long been marginalized. He stood there, determined not to be broken. The officer, for once, began to see the reality beyond his prejudices, while the young boy rediscovered his inner strength and the value of his heritage. The officer, caught off guard by the turn of events, tried to defend himself, but the murmurs of disapproval grew louder. The customers who had initially watched in silence began to speak up, sharing their own experiences of discrimination and injustice. The atmosphere in the store, once heavy, was slowly transforming into a space of solidarity. "You have no right to treat someone this way," the woman continued, confidently stepping closer to the officer. "The color of his skin does not determine his worth or his intentions. This boy deserves the same respect as anyone else here." The officer, realizing he was no longer in a position of power, crossed his arms, his expression shifting from arrogance to confusion. For the first time, he was confronted with a reality he had long ignored. He was no longer the unquestioned authority, but rather a man among others, facing the consequences of his actions. The young boy, bolstered by this wave of solidarity, felt a surge of courage. His heart was still pounding, but he tried to remain calm. He addressed the officer with a more assured tone, but without anger. "I'm not a thief. I'm here to buy a gift for my mom. I understand that you may have doubts, but I don't deserve to be treated this way." At that moment, the officer's gaze shifted slightly, a glimmer of understanding crossing his face. He realized that he had allowed his prejudices to blind him and that he had acted inappropriately. The tension in the air lifted, and a murmur of compassion spread among the customers. The store managers, having observed the scene, spoke up. A man in a suit approached the group, his expression serious. I think we all need to take a moment to reflect on what just happened. This boy deserves an apology, he said, casting a disapproving glance at the officer. Suddenly, the store's dim lighting seemed to shine a little brighter. The customers, now supporting the young man, cheered for the man in the suit, and several added their voices to the call for an apology. The pressure on the officer was mounting. Clearing his throat, the officer finally said, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have acted like that." His voice was softer, but he was finally acknowledging his mistake. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was a step toward awareness. The young boy, his eyes shining with emotion, accepted the apology with a slight nod. "Thank you," he murmured. "I hope this can help change things." The woman who had spoken up turned to the boy and said, "You're very brave. I'm proud of you. Never forget that you have value, no matter what others say." In this moment of reconciliation, the store was no longer just a place of commerce, but a space of transformation. The customers gathered around the young boy to show their support, while the officer, though uncomfortable, began to realize the impact of his actions on others. The young boy left the store with his head held high, holding the shirt for his mother, surrounded by the warmth and solidarity of those who had witnessed the injustice. This moment marked the beginning of a change, not only for him but for all those around him. He knew he had witnessed an injustice, but more than that, he had learned that even in the face of adversity, it was possible to stand up and claim his right to dignity. With his mother in mind, he set off, ready to face the world with the strength inherited from his father and the love of his family. And so, this experience, though painful, became a part of his story, a lesson in courage, identity, and the fight against prejudice.